Hello everybody, I hope you're all having a wonderful day or night, whatever time it happens to be, wherever you happen to be. My name is Jay, and welcome to episode 9 of History's Hangnails, the podcast where we deep dive on bizarre events and mysteries from our past. Today's episode takes us back to England in the mid-19th century. An influx of Irish immigrants swelled the populations of major cities, including the East End of London. From 1882, Jewish refugees fleeing from the persecution of the Russian Empire emigrated into the same areas. They were attempting to escape the large-scale, targeted, and repeated anti-Jewish rioting that began in the 19th century, known as pogroms. The parish of Whitechapel in the East End became increasingly overcrowded, with the population rising to approximately 80,000 inhabitants by 1888. Work and housing conditions worsened, and a significant economic underclass developed. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high, with around 55% of children born in the East End dying before the age of 5. Robbery, general violence, and alcohol dependency became commonplace, and the endemic poverty drove many women to prostitution to survive on a daily basis. By October of the same year, London's Metropolitan Police Service estimated that there were 62 brothels operating in Whitechapel, with at least 1,200 women working as prostitutes. Approximately 8,500 people resided in the 233 common lodging houses, cheap Victorian-era accommodation where families were all lodged together in single rooms. The nightly price for a bed in the homeless shelter, known as the coffin house, amounted to 4 pence, and the cost of sleeping upon a lean-to or hangover rope stretched across the dormitory was 2 pence per person. The economic problems in Whitechapel were only exacerbated by a steady rise in social tensions. Between 1886 and 1889, frequent public demonstrations led to police intervention and general unrest. One example of this was an event known as Bloody Sunday. During a period of worldwide economic recession known as the Long Depression, which lasted from early 1873 until almost the end of the century, there was a massive rise in rural unemployment due to falling food prices. This, in turn, caused workers to flood into the cities, eroding employment, wages, and working conditions. By November 1887, unemployed workers' demonstrations from the East End had been building up for more than 2 years. There had already been clashes between the police and members of upper-class clubs, and Trafalgar Square became the symbolic meeting point of the working-class East End and the upper-class West End. This attracted the attention of the small but growing socialist movement, the Marxists of both the Social Democratic Federation and the Socialist League, and the reformist socialists of the Fabian Society. Any police and government attempt to suppress or divert the demonstrations also brought in the radical wing of the Liberal Party and free speech activists from the National Secular Society. The working class in the cities contained many people of Irish birth or origin. London, much like the industrial areas of northern England and western Scotland, had a large Irish working class concentrated in the East End, in close proximity with increasing numbers of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. On November 13, some 30,000 people, cited as mostly respectable protesters, encircled Trafalgar Square as at least 10,000 others marched in from several different directions, led, among others, by Elizabeth Reynolds, John Burns, William Morris, Annie Besant, and Robert Cunningham Graham, primarily leaders of the Social Democratic Federation. 2,000 police officers and 400 soldiers were deployed to halt the demonstration. Burns and Cunningham Graham were arrested and imprisoned for 6 weeks. Annie Besant, who was Marxist, Fabian, and a secularist, believing in the principle of seeking to conduct human affairs based on naturalistic considerations and free of religion, spoke at the rally and offered herself for arrest, but the police declined to do so. Of the 400 arrested, only 50 were detained in custody. James Compton Merriweather, a conservative supporter, and head of Merriweather and Sons, who specialized in building steam fire engines, offered to use a 400-gallon-per-minute engine as a water cannon to clear out the rioters, but this suggestion was refused. During the fighting, many rioters were injured by police truncheons and under the hooves of police horses. The British Army's deployed forces also consisted of infantry and cavalry. Although the infantry units were marched into position with bayonets fixed, they were ordered not to open fire, and the cavalry ordered not to draw their swords. It was reported after that the wounds received by the constables were more severe than those received by the mob. The following Sunday, November 20, saw another demonstration and more casualties. Anti-Semitism, crime, nativism, racism, social disturbance, and severe deprivation influenced public perceptions that Whitechapel was a notorious den of immorality, with such perceptions only strengthening in 1888, with a large number of attacks against women in the East End, and a series of grisly homicides known collectively as the Whitechapel murders. Opinions vary as to whether these murders should have been linked to the same suspect, but at least 5 of the 11 Whitechapel murders, known as the Canonical Five, are widely believed to be the work of Jack the Ripper. Most experts point to similarities between the killings, notably deep slash wounds to the throat, followed by extensive mutilation to the abdominal area, genital area, and face, and the removal of internal organs as the Ripper's MO. There were 2 cases that shared details with the murders thought to be committed by the Ripper, though they were not counted among the Canonical Five: those of Emma Elizabeth Smith and Martha Tabram. On April 3, 1888, at approximately 1:30 a.m., Smith was robbed and sexually assaulted on Osborne Street. She was bludgeoned about the face and cut across one of her ears. A blunt object was also inserted into her vagina, rupturing her peritoneum, the membrane forming the lining of the abdominal cavity. She developed peritonitis, an inflammation of the inner wall of the membrane, and died the following day at London Hospital. Before her death, Smith had stated that she was attacked by 2 or 3 men, one of whom she described as a teenager. This attack was eventually linked to the later murders by the press, but most authors attribute Smith's murder to general East End gang violence. On August 7 of the same year, Tabram was found murdered on a staircase landing in George Yard. There were no signs of sexual assault. However, she suffered 39 stab wounds to her throat, lungs, heart, liver, spleen, stomach, and abdomen, with additional knife wounds inflicted to her breasts and vagina. All but one of Tabram's wounds was caused by a bladed instrument, and with one possible exception, the wounds had been inflicted by a right-handed individual. The savagery of the Tabra murder, along with the close proximity to the locations of the canonical murders and the lack of any obvious motive, led authorities to believe these cases were linked. The murders known as the Canonical Five included victims Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. On Friday, August 31, 1888, at around 3:40 a.m, the body of Mary Ann Nichols was discovered in Bucks Row, now known as Durward Street, in Whitechapel. Nichols was last seen alive approximately 1 hour before the discovery of her body by one Mrs. Emily Holland, with whom she had previously shared a bed at a common lodging house on Thrall Street in Spitalfields, walking in the direction of Whitechapel Road. Her throat was slashed by 2 deep cuts, one of which had completely severed all the tissue down to the vertebrae. Her vagina had been stabbed twice, and the lower part of her abdomen was partially ripped open by a deep, jagged wound, causing her bowels to protrude. Several other incisions inflicted on both sides of her abdomen were found to have been caused by the same bladed instrument, each inflicted in a downward, thrusting manner. 1 week later, on Saturday, September 8, at approximately 6 a.m, the body of Annie Chapman was discovered near the steps to the doorway of the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, Spitalfields. Again, her throat was slashed by 2 deep cuts. Her abdomen had been entirely cut open, with a section of the flesh from her stomach placed upon her left shoulder, and another section of skin and flesh, along with her small intestines, being removed and placed above her right shoulder. Chapman's autopsy revealed that her uterus and sections of her bladder and vagina had also been removed. At the inquest into Chapman's murder, one Elizabeth Long described having seen Chapman standing outside 29 Hanbury Street at about 5:30 a.m. in the company of a dark-haired man wearing a brown deerstalker hat and a dark overcoat of shabby appearance. According to a nearby eyewitness, the man was overheard asking, "Will you?" To which Chapman replied, "Yes." Both Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were killed early morning on Sunday, September 30, 1888. Stride's body was discovered at approximately 1 a.m. in Dutfield's yard off Burner Street, now known as Henriques Street, in Whitechapel. The cause of death was found to be a single clear-cut incision across her neck, measuring 6 inches, which severed her left carotid artery and her trachea before coming to a stop beneath her right jaw. The absence of any further mutilations to her body has led to uncertainty as to whether Stride's murder was committed by the Ripper, or whether he was interrupted during the attack. Several witnesses later informed police they had seen Stride in the company of a man in or close to Burner Street on the evening of September 29 and in the early hours of September 30. Unfortunately, each gave differing descriptions, with some saying that her companion was fair, others that he was dark, some saying that he was shabbily dressed, and others that he was well dressed. Edo's body was found in a corner of Mitre Square in the city of London, 3/4 of an hour after the discovery of Stride's body. Edo's throat was severed from ear to ear, her abdomen ripped open with a long, deep, and jagged wound, and her intestines placed over her right shoulder, with a section of the intestine being completely detached and placed between her body and left arm. The left kidney and the major part of Edo's uterus had been removed, and her face had been disfigured, her nose having been severed, her cheek slashed, and cuts measuring 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 inch respectively, vertically incised through both of her eyelids. A triangular incision, the apex of which pointed towards Edo's eye, had also been carved upon each of her cheeks, and a section of the auricle and lobe of her right ear was later recovered from her clothing. The police surgeon who conducted the post-mortem upon her body stated his opinion that these mutilations would have taken at least 5 minutes to complete. A local cigarette salesman named Joseph Lewend had passed by a narrow walkway to Mitre Square named Church Passage with 2 friends shortly before the murder, and later described seeing a fair-haired man of medium build with a shabby appearance with a woman who may have been Edo's. His companions were, however, unable to confirm his description. The murders of Stride and Edo's ultimately became known as the double event. At 2:55 a.m., a section of Edo's bloodied apron was found at the entrance to a tenement in Goulston Street, Whitechapel. Upon the wall, directly above where the piece of apron was found, was a message written in chalk that read, "The Jews," spelt Juwes, "are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The message appeared to imply that either a specific Jewish person or Jews in general were responsible for the series of murders, but it is unclear whether the message was written by the murderer on dropping the section of apron or merely incidental and not related to the case. Such graffiti was commonplace across Whitechapel. Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren feared that it might spark anti-Semitic riots and ordered the writing washed away before dawn. At 10:45 a.m. on Friday, November 9, the body of Mary Jane Kelly was found lying on the bed in the single room where she lived at 13 Miller's Court off Dorset Street, Spitalfields. She had been extensively mutilated and disemboweled. Her face had been, quote, hacked beyond all recognition, with her throat being severed down to the spine, and her abdomen almost entirely emptied of its organs. Her uterus, kidneys, and one breast had been placed beneath her head, and other viscera from her body placed beside her foot and about the bed. Sections of her abdomen and thighs had also been placed upon a bedside table, and her heart was missing from the scene. Multiple ashes found within the fireplace suggested Kelly's murderer had burned several combustible items to illuminate the room as he worked. A recent fire had been kept hot enough to melt the solder between a kettle and its spout, which had fallen into the grate of the fireplace. Each of the canonical 5 murders was perpetrated at night. on or close to a weekend, and either at the end of a month or a week or so after. The mutilations became increasingly severe as the series of murders proceeded, except for that of Stride, whose attacker may have been interrupted. Historically, the belief that these 5 murders were committed by the same perpetrator is derived from contemporaneous documents which link them together to the exclusion of others. The 5 victims were also linked together in a letter written on November 10, 1888 by police surgeon Thomas Bond to the head of the London CID, Robert Anderson. In 1894, Sir Melville Leslie Macnaghten, Assistant Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police Service and head of the Criminal Investigation Department, wrote on a report that stated, quote, "The Whitechapel murderer had 5 victims, and 5 victims only," suggesting his certainty on the matter. However, Macnaghten did not join the police force until the year after the murders, and his memorandum contains serious factual errors about possible suspects. Over the years, researchers have posited that some of these murders were undoubtedly the work of a single killer, but an unknown larger number of killers acting independently were responsible for other crimes. Authors Stuart P. Evans and Donald Rumbelow argue that the canonical 5 is a Ripper myth, and that 3 of the cases, Nichols, Chapman, and Eddowes, can be linked to the same perpetrator. By their reasoning, less certainty exists as to whether Stride and Kelly were also murdered by the same individual. Conversely, others have proposed that the 6 murders between Tabram and Kelly were the work of a single killer. Percy Clark, assistant to the examining pathologist George Bagster Phillips, linked only 3 of the murders and hypothesized that the others were perpetrated by, quote, weak-minded individuals induced to emulate the crime. Mary Jane Kelly is generally considered to be the Ripper's final victim, and it is assumed that the crimes ended because of the culprit's death, imprisonment, institutionalization, or emigration. The Whitechapel murders file details another 4 murders that occurred after the canonical 5, those of Rose Mylett, Alice Mackenzie, Frances Coles, and the body of a woman known only as the Pinchin Street Torso. On December 20, 1888, the body of 26-year-old Rose Mylett was found in Clark's Yard, High Street. She had died of asphyxiation, though initially, police found no evidence of a struggle, leading them to believe that she had either accidentally hanged herself with her collar while in a drunken stupor or committed suicide. Despite this, faint markings left by what appeared to be cord were discovered across one side of her neck, suggesting she may have been purposefully strangled. At the inquest into Mylett's death, the jury returned a verdict of murder. Alice Mackenzie was thought to be murdered shortly after midnight, on July 17, 1889. She had suffered 2 stab wounds to her neck, and her left carotid artery had been severed. Across her body was noted several minor bruises and cuts, and a 7-inch long superficial wound extending from her left breast to her navel. One of the examining pathologists, Thomas Bond, believed this to be one of the Ripper's victims, though his colleague, Phillips, who had examined the bodies of the previous 3 victims, disagreed. It has also been suggested that Mackenzie's murderer had simply copied the Ripper's MO in order to deflect suspicion from himself. On December 10, 1889, the decomposing torso of an unidentified woman, thought to be between the ages of 30 and 40, and missing her head and legs, was discovered beneath a railway arch in Pinchin Street, Whitechapel. Bruising about the victim's back, hip, and arm indicated the decedent had been extensively beaten shortly before her death. The victim's abdomen was also extensively mutilated, though her genitals remained intact. She appeared to have been killed approximately 1 day prior to the discovery of her torso, and the dismembered sections of her body were believed to have been transported to the railway arch, hidden under an old chemise dress. On February 13, 1891, at 2:15 a.m, PC Ernest Thompson discovered 25-year-old Frances Coles, also lying beneath a railway arch, this time at Swallow Gardens in Whitechapel. Her throat had been deeply cut, but her body was not mutilated, leading some to believe Thompson had disturbed her assailant. Coles was still alive, though she died a short time later, before medical assistance could arrive. 53-year-old James Thomas Sadler had earlier been seen drinking with Coles, and the two are known to have argued approximately 3 hours before her death. Sadler was arrested by the police and charged with her murder, even briefly becoming the main suspect for the Ripper murders. However, on March 3, 1891, he was discharged from court for lack of evidence. In addition to the Whitechapel murders initially attributed to the Ripper, other cases also served to muddy the waters. On December 26, 1887, approximately 4 months before the attack on Emma Elizabeth Smith, a woman's body was allegedly found in a doorway close to Commercial Road with a stake thrust through her abdomen. She remained unidentified and was referred to only as Fairy Faye. However, it was later noted that no murders had been recorded in Whitechapel at or around Christmas that year. It would appear that the case of Fairy Faye was most likely created through confused press reports of the Smith murder, which showed similar circumstances. On February 25, 1888, a 38-year-old widow, Annie Millwood, was admitted to the Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary with numerous stab wounds to her legs and lower torso. She informed staff that she had been attacked with a clasp knife by an unknown man and was eventually discharged after being treated. On March 31, she was reported to have died of natural causes, and while she is considered by some to be the Ripper's first victim, the attack cannot be definitively linked. On March 28, a young dressmaker named Ada Wilson reportedly survived being stabbed twice in the neck, also with a clasp knife, upon the doorstep of her home in Bow, by a man who had demanded money from her. A further possible victim, 40-year-old Annie Farmer, reported being attacked on November 21. She resided at the same lodging house as Martha Tabram and had received a superficial cut to her throat. Strangely, witnesses reported that an unknown man with blood on his mouth and hands had run out of the lodging house, shouting, "Look at what she has done," prior to anyone hearing Farmer scream. This led authorities to determine her injury had likely been self-inflicted. A short time before this, on October 2, the headless torso of a woman was discovered in the basement of the new Metropolitan Police headquarters being built in Whitehall at that time. An arm and a shoulder belonging to the body were previously discovered floating in the River Thames near Pimlico on September 11, and the left leg was subsequently discovered buried near where the torso was found. The mutilations found were noted to be similar in method to those of the Pinchin Street torso case. The other limbs and head were never recovered, and the body was never identified. This case became known only as the Whitehall Mystery. On December 29, the body of 7-year-old John Gill was found in a stable block in Manningham, Bradford. Gill had been missing since December 27. His legs had been severed, his abdomen opened, his intestines partly drawn out, and his heart and one ear removed. Similarities with the confirmed Ripper murders led to press speculation that he was also to blame for this crime. The boy's employer, 23-year-old milkman William Barrett, was twice arrested for the murder, but was released due to insufficient evidence, and no other suspects were prosecuted. Both the Whitehall and Pinchin cases became collectively known as the Thames Mysteries, and were considered to be the work of a single serial killer, dubbed the Torso Killer. Contention remains as to whether this killer and the Ripper were the same person, or separate killers active in the same area. The MO of the Torso Killer differed from that of the Ripper, and police at the time had discounted any connection between the two. Over a 3-week period, between May 31 and June 25, 1889, various body parts were collected from the River Thames. Eventually, these were found to belong to a 24-year-old prostitute from Chelsea, Elizabeth Jackson. She was the only victim linked to the Torso Killer to be identified. On April 24, 1891, the body of Carrie Brown was discovered strangled and mutilated in her room in New York City. She had a large tear through her groin area and superficial cuts on her legs and back. No organs were removed from the scene, though an ovary was found upon the bed, either purposely removed or unintentionally dislodged. At this time, the murder was compared to those in Whitechapel, though the Metropolitan Police eventually ruled out any connection. The vast majority of the City of London police files relating to their investigation into the Whitechapel murders were destroyed during the Blitz, a German bombing campaign carried out against the UK during World War II. However, surviving documents still allow a fairly detailed view of investigative procedures during the Victorian era. Their patterns tended to follow a similar route to modern police investigation. A large team of policemen conducted house-to-house inquiries throughout Whitechapel, collecting forensic material for later examination. Suspects were identified, traced, and either examined more closely or eliminated from the inquiry. More than 2,000 people were interviewed, upwards of 300 suspects were investigated, and 80 people were detained. Following the murders of Stride and Eddowes, the Commissioner of the City Police, Sir James Fraser, even offered a reward of £500 for the arrest of the Ripper. The investigation was initially conducted by the Metropolitan Police's CID, headed by Detective Inspector Edmund Reed. After the murder of Nichols, Detective Inspectors Frederick Aberline, Henry Moore, and Walter Andrews were sent from central office at Scotland Yard to assist. The City of London Police were involved under Detective Inspector James McWilliam after the Eddowes murder, which occurred within the City of London. The overall direction of the murder inquiries was hampered by the fact that the newly appointed head of the CID, Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson, was on leave in Switzerland between September 7 and October 6, the stretch of time during which Chapman, Stride, and Eddowes had been killed. This prompted Colonel Sir Charles Warren, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, to appoint Chief Inspector Donald Swanson to coordinate the inquiry from Scotland Yard. Butchers, slaughterers, surgeons and physicians were suspected due to the manner of the mutilations. A surviving note from Acting Commissioner of the City Police, Major Henry Smith, indicates that the alibis of local butchers and slaughterers were investigated, resulting in them being eliminated from the inquiry. A report from Inspector Swanson to the Home Office confirms that 76 were visited in total, and that the inquiry encompassed all their employees from the previous 6 months. Some contemporaneous figures, including Queen Victoria, had posited that the pattern of murders indicated that the culprit was a butcher or cattle drover working on one of the cattle boats that plied between London and mainland Europe. Whitechapel was close to the London docks, and such boats usually docked on Thursday or Friday and departed on Saturday or Sunday. The cattle boats were examined, but the dates of the murders did not coincide with a single boat's movements, and the transfer of a crewman between boats was also ruled out. In September of 1888, a group of volunteer citizens in London's East End began patrolling the streets and formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, partly out of dissatisfaction with the failure of police to apprehend the perpetrator, and also because some members were concerned that the murders were affecting businesses in the area. The committee petitioned the government to raise a reward for information leading to the arrest of the killer, offered their own reward of £50, and hired private detectives to question witnesses independently. Towards the end of October, police surgeon Thomas Bond was asked to give his opinion on the extent of the murderer's surgical skill and knowledge. The opinion offered by Bond on the character of the Whitechapel murderer is the earliest surviving offender profile. Bond's assessment was based on his own examination of the most extensively mutilated victim and the post-mortem notes from the 4 previous canonical murders. He wrote, "All 5 murders, no doubt, were committed by the same hand. In the first 4, the throats appear to have been cut from left to right. In the last case, owing to the extensive mutilation, it is impossible to say in what direction the final cut was made, but arterial blood was found on the wall in splashes close to where the woman's head must have been lying. All circumstances surrounding the murders lead me to form the opinion that the women must have been lying down when murdered, and in every case, the throat was first cut." Bond was strongly opposed to the idea that the murderer possessed any kind of scientific or anatomical knowledge, or even, quote, the technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer. He stated the killer must have been a man of solitary habits, subject to, quote, periodical attacks of homicidal and erotic mania, with the character of the mutilations possibly indicating satyriasis or hypersexuality, a term used for a presumed mental disorder which causes unwanted or excessive sexual arousal to the point of distress or impairment. He also posited that, quote, The homicidal impulse may have developed from a revengeful or brooding condition of the mind, or that religious mania may have been the original disease, but I do not think either hypothesis is very likely. There exists no evidence the perpetrator engaged in sexual activity with any of the victims, yet psychologists propose that the penetration of the victims with a knife and, quote, leaving them on display in sexually degrading positions with the wounds exposed, indicates that the perpetrator derived sexual pleasure from the attacks. In addition to contradictions and unreliability of contemporaneous accounts, attempts to identify the murderer are hampered by the lack of any surviving forensic evidence. DNA analysis on extant letters remains inconclusive, and the available material has been handled many times and is too contaminated to provide meaningful results. There have, however, been mutually incompatible claims that DNA evidence points conclusively to two different suspects: Aaron Kosminski, a barber in Whitechapel at the time, and an artist, Walter Sickert. The concentration of the killings around weekends and public holidays, and within a short distance of each other, indicated to many that the Ripper was in regular employment in the local area. Others posited that he was an educated upper-class man, possibly a doctor, or an aristocrat who ventured into Whitechapel from a more well-to-do area. Such hypotheses drew on cultural perceptions, such as an irrational fear of the medical profession, a mistrust of modern science, and the exploitation of the poor by the rich. The term Ripperology was coined to describe the study and analysis of the Ripper case in an effort to determine his identity, with the murders inspiring numerous works of fiction. Suspects proposed years after the murders include virtually anyone remotely connected to the case by contemporaneous documents, as well as many famous names who were never even considered by the police, such as Lewis Carroll and Prince Albert Victor. Over the course of the Whitechapel murders, the police, newspapers, and other individuals received hundreds of letters regarding the case. Some letters were well-intentioned offers of advice regarding capture of the killer, but the vast majority were either hoaxes or found to be generally useless. Hundreds of these letters also claimed to be from the killer himself, and 3 of these in particular are considered prominent: the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter. The Dear Boss letter, dated September 25 and postmarked September 27, 1888, was received that same day by the Central News Agency, a news distribution service founded in 1863, and was forwarded to Scotland Yard on September 29. Initially, it was brushed aside as a hoax, but when Eddowes was found just 3 days after the letter's postmark, with a section of one ear cut from her body, the promise by the author to, quote, clip the lady's ear off, gained attention. With this in mind, Eddowes' ear appears to have been nicked by the killer incidentally during his attack, rather than intentionally cut, and the letter writer's threat to mail ears to the police was never carried out. The name Jack the Ripper was first used in this letter by the signatory, and gained worldwide notoriety after its publication. Most of the letters that followed copied this letter's tone, with some authors adopting pseudonyms such as George of the High Rip Game and Jack Sheridan the Ripper. Some sources claim that a separate letter dated September 17, 1888, was the first to coin the infamous moniker, but most experts believe this was a fake inserted into police records sometime during the 20th century. The Saucy Jackie postcard was postmarked October 1, 1888, and was also received that same day by the Central News Agency. The handwriting was similar to that found in the Dear Boss letter and mentioned the canonical murders committed on September 30, which the author refers to by writing, quote, "double event this time." It has been argued that the postcard was posted before the murders were publicised, making it unlikely that an imposter would hold such knowledge of the crimes. The postmark was, however, noted to be 24 hours after the killings occurred, long after the details were publicised by journalists. The From Hell letter was received by George Lusk, leader of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, on October 16, 1888. The handwriting and style were unlike that of the other letters, and came with a small box, in which Lusk discovered half of a human kidney, preserved in what we know today as ethanol. Edo's left kidney had been removed by the killer, and the writer of this letter claimed he had, quote, fried and ate the missing half. But there is disagreement as to whether the kidney indeed belonged to Edo's, with some believing it to be nothing more than a macabre joke. On October 3, Scotland Yard had published facsimiles of the Dear Boss letter and the postcard in an ultimately vain hope that a member of the public may recognise the handwriting. George R. Sims, a journalist, poet and novelist, scathingly implied in the newspaper, the Sunday Referee, that the letter was written by another journalist, quote, to hurl the circulation of a newspaper sky high. Police officials later claimed to have identified this specific journalist as Tom Bullen, thought to be the author of both the Dear Boss letter and the postcard. This was revealed in a letter sent to Sims from Chief Inspector John Littlechild, dated September 23, 1913. In 1931, a journalist named Fred Best reportedly confessed that he, along with a colleague at a London evening newspaper known as The Star, had written the letters signed Jack the Ripper to heighten interest in the murders and, quote, keep the business alive. The Whitechapel murders marked an important watershed in the treatment of crime by journalists and media in general. He was not the first recognised serial killer to exist, but his case was the first of its kind to create a worldwide media frenzy, and certainly assisted the naming conventions the media use to refer to these killers. The nature of these murders and the impoverished lifestyle of the victims drew attention to the poor living conditions in the East End, ultimately galvanising public opinion against the overcrowded and unsanitary slums. During the 2 years since the murders, the worst of these slums were cleared and demolished. In the immediate aftermath, Jack the Ripper was told to become somewhat of a boogeyman, with depictions often appearing phantasmic or monstrous. During the 1920s and 30s, he was shown in films, dressed in everyday clothes, as a man with a hidden secret preying on his unsuspecting victims. Despite any attempts, past or present, to determine the identity of the Ripper, the investigations and media circus that followed, or any positive changes to society as a result, the reality remains that the person or people who perpetrated these horrifying deeds would have been deeply disturbed, and the victims of these crimes were undoubtedly not treated with the respect they should have garnered. Among others, many of those who were considered to be lacking status, power, or wealth, people of other races, and sex workers were known as the less dead. No matter our advancements in criminal investigation or developments of scientific methods for determining the information these investigations rely on, this idea that a certain class or group of people are less important than another will forever plague the victims of these crimes and their families by extension. And that is the legacy of the series of murders committed by the mere shadow known as Jack the Ripper. Don't forget, I stream 4 days a week over at twitch.tv/jayborwocky, that's JAYBBERWOCKY. You can also show your support and help out the podcast by heading to patreon.com/jayborwocky and signing up for one of the member tiers listed. Make sure to keep a weather eye out for announcements regarding future episodes. @HangnailPod is the official Twitter for the podcast, and all announcements will appear there. Thank you all for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I'll see you next time.